Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jenny Ifft. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Agricultural Economics, and I'm going to be talking about the Supplemental Coverage Option, SCO. So part of my talk, I will go over the basics of SCO and also tie in what I call higher coverage policies. I'll define those in a little bit. I'm also going to go through some analysis of two different things. First of all, what are the potential payouts from SCO? What do those look like over time, as well as how a producer could go about thinking about protecting their expected revenue with SCO and the relationship of their yields with county yields. So first of all, what are high coverage policies? SCO, the supplemental coverage option, is one type of high coverage policies. And what these do generally is they're going to increase your crop insurance coverage level up to 95% of expected revenue. So typically with YP or RP, you can go up to 85%. These are going to allow you to increase your coverage level. I have gross profit margin in there as well. That's referring to margin protection. The deadline for margin protection for 2023 was in the fall, so I'm not going to talk about it here, but I did want to make a note, just in case producers, if you're thinking about these high coverage policies, generally, that is something to consider. And one of the key components of this is the payouts on high coverage policies are based on county level yields. So they're going to work differently than standard revenue protection policies that most people are using for row crops these days. So first of all, the overall concept, again, these policies all have a county-based trigger. So payouts are going to be determined based on what happens to county yields, not on farm yields. And you could also think of it, if you look at these charts here, they basically allow you to increase your coverage. So you have your underlying MPCI policy. It could be 75%, 65%. If you use SCO, that's going to bring you up to 86%. There's another high coverage policy, enhanced coverage option, that could bring a producer up to 95% of expected revenue. I'm not going to talk much about ECO here. There are additional materials on ECO on Ag Manager I've talked about in the past, and I'm happy to answer questions. I did want to cover a little bit of it, though, because for those producers who want to use ARC, ECO is an option to increase your coverage level. There's two choices here. It's going to cover either the 86% to 90% band or from 86 to 95%. You can use it with an underlying yield protection or revenue protection policy. You can use it with a supplemental coverage option, but you don't have to. Again, it can be used with ARC, but if you're using other area plans, then you can't use ECO. So a few other details, as we've stated a lot, you can't use it with ARC. The premium subsidy on SCO is 65%. That means if you're using enterprise units, that's going to be lower than the enterprise unit premium subsidy for policies at 75% or below. However, if you're using basic or optional units, it's going to be higher than those policies at 65% or above. Now, I'm going to give you an example. This doesn't directly translate to premiums because those underlying policies based on enterprise or basic units, those might be rated a little bit higher. Those might be considered a little risky, so they're going to have a higher premium cost, but it certainly does factor into the overall cost. Also, so SCO, whatever your underlying policy is, it's going to bring you up to 86%. So if you have a lower underlying coverage level, say 60%, then the SCO premium is going to be pretty high. If you have a higher underlying coverage level, so if you're at 80% or even 85%, then your SCO premium is going to seem lower. Another key point is the payments are not made until RMA publishes county level yields. So what that means from a practical perspective is that if you do get payments from 2023, you're not going to receive them until 2024. So those can take quite a bit longer than payments made for individual policies. So next, how is SCO being used in Kansas? So if you look at this chart here, it started back in 2015. We have acres on the y-axis. So pretty low use until 2018. It started to tick up in 2019, and it continues to increase every year. We have corn in blue, then sorghum red, and soybeans is green. So even though this has gone up, it's still about 5% of total acres insured. So it's not being used a lot. I think there's a couple different factors here. First of all, it is an additional cost, so your premiums can go up quite a bit when you use SCO or other high coverage policies. I will explain why in a little bit. Next is a new product, so new products take a while to get used to. So you can see a pretty big lag. A lot of this trend could be that folks are using ARC, and it might be that producers are using different types of risk management instead of SCO. Now, there's three key characteristics of SCO that I like to emphasize when I talk about it. It's sort of the take home here. These would also apply to ECO for that matter. First of all, it's going to cost quite a bit more. It's going to pay out quite a bit more as well. Could be out quite frequently compared to underlying policies. And if you're thinking about SCO or any high coverage policy, long-term perspective is going to be really important. And I'll go through each of these. First of all, cost, I want to get that out of the way first. Some folks will save it till the end, but I just like to put it out there and then explain why the costs are higher. So I have two examples here for 2023, irrigated corn in Finney County, Kansas, and non-irrigated soybeans in northeastern Kansas. So if your yields look different or in your different counties, you can just look at the relative levels here. You don't have to pay that much attention to the exact numbers. So our first example here, again, 2023 irrigated corn in southwestern Kansas with a yield of about 205 bushels per acre. So if you purchase an underlying revenue protection policy with enterprise units, if you start at 65% coverage level, that'd be $6 per acre, going all the way up to $22 per acre. So quite a big difference there. I think what these three coverage levels are really what's most commonly used in Kansas. You don't see a lot of 80% policies. And so if you add on SCO, especially at these lower coverage levels, it can double your costs or more. So it's going to seem like a pretty large increase in premium. So next, if we look at soybeans, this is in northeastern Kansas, non-irrigated, assuming a yield of about 51 bushels per acre. Again, the operation is using enterprise units. And so depending on your coverage level, your underlying premium can go anywhere from $5 to $16 per acre. And if you're using SCO, you see your costs could double or more. So one thing two things I'd like to note about the cost. The first of all is if you look at this sort of 65 to 75% range, the total cost, the cost of your RP plus your SCO, they're pretty similar and they're not exactly the same. And again, these are only example premiums, so I wouldn't advise, don't look at, don't get too much into the details, but at a high level, they're pretty similar across these different underlying coverage levels. One thing I think that could explain this, if you're using enterprise units, you have to your premium subsidy rate is higher. For RP, but with SCO, the premium cost itself is probably lower because that risk is spread out across the county. So I thought that's pretty interesting. It's really something a producer needs to work through with an agent. The other point that I would say is if somebody is using basic or optional units, the premium for RP for your underlying policy is going to be a lot more expensive. and SCO might look more attractive. So there's different combinations of that, again, that you could work through with an agent. Next, it pays out more frequently. So why does it cost more? Because it's providing a higher coverage level. It's probably going to be triggered a lot more than the underlying policy. So we have these maps for Kansas for corn, soybeans, wheat, and grain sorghum. And we look at the historic likelihood of SCO being triggered from 2000 to 2021. And so the percent is the percent of years that we estimate SCO would have been triggered with an underlying revenue protection policy in Kansas. So for any county that's blue, red, purple, or yellow, SCO would have triggered at least in 1 out of 3 years, maybe more. It wouldn't have triggered quite as often. We have less yield variability here in southeastern Kansas, but generally, in a lot of parts of the state, you do expect to see it pay out more. And these maps, if you look at the enhanced coverage option, again, over time, you do expect to see a higher likelihood of payouts. And there's a link here where you can get into a lot more detail on agmanager.info. Like I'm doing again. All right, so this is, again, these percents are the percent of years between 2000 and 2021 that SCO would have been likely to pay out. But an important part of this is it's not necessarily going to pay out that frequently or every third year. You could have it pay out several years in a row, and then you could have it not pay out for several years in a row. So you need to look at it over time as well. And here's a set of charts that we made for Ag Manager. These are for select counties in Kansas. So you can go here and look at these. I'm happy to make it for additional counties if anybody reaches out. But this is here is the ratio of actual to expected revenue, again, from 2000 to 2021 for a underlying revenue protection policy. This example here is non-irrigated soybeans for Washington County, Kansas. So if, first of all, if we look at these dots that are right up here, we capped it at 100%. So that means that actual revenue, so harvest prices times actual yields, was higher than expected revenue. So there wouldn't have been payouts for anything here. Next, if we go down, if we look at the underlying policy, there's this brown dash line at 75%. So that what that signifies is when you have actual revenue below 75%, then your underlying policy is likely to be triggered. So for this crop, we don't see it happening too often. Couple years here. But again, this is, part of Kansas where there's relatively more stable yields, and it's also for soybeans. So next we can look at this band between 86% and 75%. That's where your SCO is going to be triggered, but not necessarily your underlying policy. So you do see quite a few years here where you're likely to have an SCO indemnity. Again, I have these maps for several counties in Kansas, and happy to replicate them for additional counties if anybody is interested. And this is going to give you an idea of what the experience is like over time. And again, you could get pretty significant payouts if you look at the whole period, but you can definitely go a couple of years without any payments, depending, again, on the crop and the part of the state where you are. So the last point here, SCO policies are a long-term decision. This is really a different paradigm, different approach, a different way of thinking about risk management. It requires a much larger upfront investment. You're going to be paying significantly higher premiums. Now these policies are just because of the premium subsidy, they are designed so that if a producer does it long enough, they should come out ahead. And that's the typical experience. It's not guaranteed to happen, but that's how they are designed to happen if you do it long enough. However, sort of the expectation that you can go a while without getting a payout needs to be well understood. And generally, I'd say if you haven't done this before, if a producer isn't used to these high coverage policies, it's really something, there's a lot of different options. It's something you have to invest some time in. There's a pretty big learning curve. Hopefully it's something a crop insurance agent could sit down with you and work through. Now to switch over to where are we right now? And what does a revenue guarantee, the crop insurance guarantee look like for this year? Well, we're still in a very high price environment. I have corn prices here. Costs are still, it's pretty important because costs are still high as well. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But first of all, our 2023 projected price about $5.96. I checked this morning. We're still in price discovery, so that won't be final until the beginning of March. But if you look for last year, prices are very similar to last year. Harvest prices were higher. Prices were lower than in the past 3 years. But generally, a lot of county expected yields are a little bit higher for 2022. What this means is that in a lot of cases, we're expecting to see higher revenue, slightly higher revenue. I think so I have Finney County here for irrigated corn. Yields are just a couple bushels per acre higher. You have the slightly higher prices. So the guarantee is $23 per acre higher than last year. So the question with this is, how far is this revenue going to go compared to the costs that producers are facing? I generally like to look at this. What are current profit margins, especially when you're thinking about investing in high coverage policies? To do this, I use our crop budgets from K-State. Now, these are averages that are specific to certain crops or regions of the state. So they're not going to reflect necessarily what an individual producer is facing, but they do give you an idea of the general, what are our prices and how far are they going and covering our costs, and what are profit margins for this year. So first of all, if we look at irrigated corn in Southwest Kansas, expecting a little bit over $1,400 per acre in revenue. Direct expenses about $750. Indirect are about $460 in indirect. So indirect would cover cash rents, interest expense, depreciation. And that gives about a little bit over $200 per acre in expected profits for this year. So if you look at a producer who's purchased a 70% revenue protection policy, that's going to cover not quite $1,000 of revenue. And that'll cover the direct expenses and some of the indirect. So it's gonna, cover your expenses, make sure you can pay back your operating loan. Now, if you add SCO on top of that, that brings your guarantee up to a little over $1,200, and then it's going to cover all of those direct and indirect expenses. If you're a producer whose cost structure is a little lower, it might cover some of your profits. In the next example, we have non-irrigated soybeans in northeastern Kansas, where there's about $600 per acre of expected revenue, $300 in direct expenses, and $178 in indirect. So expected profit of about $121 per acre. So how far is that crop insurance guarantee going to go? If you have a 70% revenue protection policy, that's going to cover about $418. So that's covering all the direct expenses as well as some of the indirect. If you look at the guarantee, if you add on SCO, then you have a guarantee that covers all of your expenses as well as some of your profits. So if we think about both market prices and costs going into this year, the underlying insurance policies are really, protecting your expenses, if you add on these high cover policies, you're more likely to be protecting your profit margin. Time. So there's a couple of different approaches to thinking through the SCO decision. The first would be focused on indemnities. So as I said previously, these policies are designed so the producer comes out ahead in the long run. One rule of thumb that I like to use is to compare the SCO premium to the SCO liability. So if you have SCO and your underlying policy is triggered, you get that full liability as your indemnity. So if you have SCO with a 70 or 75% underlying policy, if that underlying policy is triggered, assuming your yields are closely enough correlated with the county, you could get that full liability. So if you compare the premium versus liability, well, how many years, that's going to give you sort of a rule of thumb for how many years out of how many years would I need to get the underlying policy triggered to get back my premium. So, for some of the policies I looked at, it could be 1 in 10 years. So just a rule of thumb. It's a little simple, but I think it's helpful. We also have the crop insurance maps that I just discussed, and a lot of agents have decision tools that are pretty useful. So next, I think, it's sort of this risk reduction. So you really want to protect your operations, expected profits this year. So one part of this is understanding potential 2023 payouts. How far will this go for me? And then how are your yields related to county yields? And we have 2 tools to do this. I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. I'm going to introduce both of these. We have a payment calculator that looks at this year and a yield correlation tool that looks at the historic relationship between a producer's yields and county yields. So first of all, we have our ECO, SCO, and ECO payment calculator. This is a tool that we've put out on agmanager.info for several years now. And this works for the entire US, where you can go enter your county, what you're growing, practice and type. And then you can enter in different numbers for what was your, what county yield and harvest price numbers. And you can do a scenario analysis, projected price. We have the current projected price listed here since they're not final. You put in your underlying crop insurance coverage level as well as your APH. And this is going to give you your potential payments under different SCO policies, or SCO with different underlying policies. And then you can go back up and, make projections with different harvest prices and different yields to see what that's going to look like. The link to that is down here. So the next question, again, with this county-based trigger is, will I get the SCO indemnity if my own yields decline? Because of the county-based trigger, you could have years where you have a yield decrease and you don't get a payment. On the other hand, you could not have a yield decline and still receive a payment if the county averages are moving different than yours. So the question here, how correlated are my yields with county level yields? A couple notes about correlation. So by correlation, what I don't mean is that nothing is yields the same. Your yields don't need to be the same as the county. They need to move in the same direction. So when you have a large yield decline, is your county also likely to have a large yield decline? It's not about absolute yields. Also, you could have positive or negative correlation. So I think in most cases, we're going to be looking at positive correlation. Negative correlation means that your yields are almost always likely to move in the opposite direction of your county. So when the county goes up, you go down. So I think it's unlikely, but if it did happen, it would be a pretty good sign that your payout, these payouts for SCO aren't going to be very well matched to what's happening to your farm at all. So there's a new yield correlation tool that we just posted to Ag Manager. This is something I just developed this year, so it's brand new. So I appreciate if you have any feedback about the language, any problems, please let me know. If there's any additional information that would be helpful, I could also think about incorporating it as well. And this is a pretty simple tool. The main thing that you're going to need is information on your yield. So this is a spreadsheet. You enter your county, crop you want to look at: corn, soybeans, wheat, and grain sorghum are what we have right now, and then irrigated or non-irrigated. And from this, the tool will pull the RMA actual yield, so actual county yields, and then you're going to put in your yield. If you don't have it, you can leave it blank. Right now, we have it going back to 1990. But if your yields don't go back that far, that's fine. You don't have to enter them. You can enter yields for your units, for your operation as a whole. So your farm level, enterprise level, APH, that's up to you. So the first output this is going to do is a chart that compares the RMA county yield to your yield. So in this example, the red is the RMA yield, and the green dots are the producer's yield. So you can see how close they were over time. And then we've added in trend lines. So the red is the trend line for RMA or county yields, and the green is for your operation. So if you're above or below that, it gives an idea if yields are going to be higher than expected. So if we look at this year, I think that's 2008, you can see that the county and individual yields were both below trend. So that was a low, a lower than usual yield year for both operations. This is going to give you a visual of what that looks like. But ultimately, what's the strength of the relationship? For that, we calculate a correlation coefficient. So this is a correlation of your yields to your county yields. This is only going to apply to the years that you entered yields. So the quality of that number is going to be based on what information you enter. So this example here, I have 0.85, and then I've provided a scale for the strength of the correlation. So high correlation, 0.7 to 0.1, moderate, 0.3 to 0.7, and weak is 0 to 0.3. That should be 0.3. So, you know, these aren't hard cutoffs, and they're going to depend on what a producer is comfortable with, but it does give you a measure of how much the movement of your yield is following the movement of county yields. And again, if it's negative, it means that more often than not, your yields are moving in the opposite direction of county yields. I don't expect to see that much, but it is a pretty good sign that a producer's yields are, a producer is not likely to get an SCO payment. Very likely to get an SCO payment when they have a yield loss. I have a link here to county yield information from RMA, and you can also use some tools we have on Ag Manager to get that information. So to wrap up, SCO could be attractive for producers who want to protect their profit margins, especially in 2023 when we're seeing higher expenses, and they're willing to pay the additional premium to this. I do think a long-term perspective is important for this, as it's possible to go a couple of years without triggering an indemnity. Something really to work with a crop insurance agent closely on if you're interested in, as well as considering the broader universe of high coverage policies. Also, I think that relationship between your operation or your farm and county level trend yields is an important consideration. So I think Robin and I can start going through questions now. I see we have several in the chat.
Well, we're looking at those questions in the chat. I think I'll invite Todd Barrows to come on. He's with the Kansas Farm Service Agency office and was going to say a couple words about making your appointment and getting signed up. So while we're looking at the chat, Todd, why don't you go ahead and do that?
All right. Thank you very much, Robin. Hopefully y'all can hear me, but yeah, my name is Todd Barrows and I'm the Farm Program Chief Specialist with Kansas FSA. And I really do appreciate Robin and Jenny letting me tag on to this conversation and listen in today. Right now, I do want to, and I appreciate Robin's comments and what she led off with as far as we need to have your cooperation as producers out there across the country to make your appointments, to get in and make your elections and your enrollments with these ARC PLC program. As you heard Robin state, it would really take a big price swing in order to make that, to maybe change your need to change that election coverage. With that, we would encourage you to make that appointment as soon as possible and know that you can always come back in and revise that election option by the March 15th deadline if something would come up and you would decide to change your mind and do something differently. When I was looking at the heat maps and tracking our progress, in Kansas, we're roughly at 49.4% enrolled. The good news is that's 5% ahead of where we've been the last 2 years. The other side of that is we got about 15,000 more contracts, or 52,000 more contracts to go. And as you know, the deadline is March the 15th, but for election and for enrollment. So our staff are back at work. They're ready and able to help you. So please call and make an appointment. We have a lot of other crop disaster programs that we're still rolling out. We just rolled out 2 in the last week. Things are going to be busy. So the sooner you call and get that appointment scheduled, the better chance we have being able to give you the time that you need and deserve and get your farm and your enrollment taken care of. The one thing I wanted to clarify on, I know there were some questions earlier on in chat regarding whether or not pinto beans and millet are eligible covered commodities. And I just wanted to provide a clarification on that. I did a little bit of research right quick. And so pinto beans would be considered a covered commodity because it is classified as a dry edible bean, and dry edibles are classified as pulse crops, and pulse crops are covered commodities. Millet, however, is not a covered commodity under the current ARC PLC program. So with that, that's all I wanted to share. The only other thing I guess I could allude to is, especially, if you divide Kansas in half, the northern half of the counties in Kansas are setting a little bit above average as far as enrollment. If you're in a county in the southern part of the state, those counties are a little below average. So therefore, judge accordingly, but, as soon as possible, please go ahead and schedule those appointments. The local office personnel is there and ready to assist you. And again, if you make a decision now and something happens between now and March 15th and you change your mind, it's no problem to come in and revise that election. So with that, I will turn it back over to Robin, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to tag on to your meeting today.
Thank you for being on, Todd. Before you jump your audio off here, there was a question in the chat that I'm pretty sure I know the answer to, but it's directed to you. So I'm going to make you answer it. If they fail to enroll or elect ARC or PLC, what's the default program they're going to be assigned?
It goes back to its default to PLC.
Okay, thank you.
So it looks like some people are hopping on and helping other people, and I really appreciate that. So one question is, do you have to have an underlying revenue protection policy? And somebody else answered that. So I use revenue protection in a lot of my examples because it's the most common policy, but you just have to have some underlying policy. It doesn't have to be revenue protection. It could be yield protection or something else. Somebody asked for the maps for Dickinson County, so I'll go ahead and do those. If you want to email me, it might help, but otherwise I'll just post them to Ag Manager. I don't have maps for other states, but I'm happy to talk about that. We do focus on Kansas. Somebody asked why you have to have PLC and SCO.
Yeah.
That's partially a question for the politicians, right?
Well, so yeah,
Farm bill decision.
when our county came about in the 2014 Farm Bill, it was a revenue protection that had an 86% coverage, basically that 14% deductible. And it was just kind of thought that maybe we should have something to help those enrolled in PLC also have some enhanced revenue coverage. And that's when SCO came out. That was the same time as the Ark County program. So it's really meant to cover the gaps of those that are enrolled in PLC, that they can buy up to 86% coverage on their crop insurance and have a similar protection to Ark County. So that's kind of why it is that way. I do question now if it still needs to be, but that's the history of it. Most of the other questions I think I answered directly in the chat. So thanks, Jenny, for pulling that one up.
Yep. I think I got all of the other questions that are in the chat. I know there was some specific question about the timing of payments. And I think those were answered.
All right. So as we wrap up here, any additional questions or comments for us today?
Hey, Robin, this is Todd again. Can I jump back in?
Absolutely.
Yeah, on the question there regarding the default election is PLC. However, I just want to clarify that, I guess, a little bit more if I can. And that is, if your election is going to roll forward from the previous year. So if your election, was Ark County last year on that commodity-based crop, and you want to stay Ark County, that election is going to roll forward. It would only go to a default election if it's a new base that comes back onto that farm, and really the only way that can happen or the most prominent way that happens is if you got a CRP base that was set aside due to Conservation Reserve Program, and that CRP land expired, and then you get that base back. And if you don't have an election for that crop base, and you don't make election by the March 15th deadline, it will default to the PLC. But your elections from the previous year will roll forward unless you change them. Thanks. That's all I had, Robin.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Todd. All right. Any last questions?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to call it a day.
Feel free to reach out to either of us, and especially on the new yield correlation tool. I'd love for a couple of you to get in and use it and see how it works and give me feedback. That's how we improve things.
So thank you much for joining us. We will have the recording of this up and emailed out to anybody who registered, but watch Ag Manager as this new Farm Bill is being negotiated, and we will follow along with what's going on.